The first thing I heard was the beeping, a continuous, repetitive sound that became my only connection to reality. It reminded me that I was still alive, even though everything else around me was a haze. I could not open my eyes. I couldn't move, speak, or tell anyone I was still alive. I was conscious but powerless, stuck in a black hole of quiet. For months, Sam, my nurse, was my only companion, but I couldn't say anything to him. I couldn't even nod in acknowledgement. He would converse with me and tell me what was going on in the outside world, but I was unable to answer. It felt like I was drifting in an unending black ocean, aware of everything yet unable to interact with anything. I eventually learned that my name was Rebecca Carter and that for the past year my twin sister Rachel had been living my life. I don't recall the accident that brought me here. The medics described it as a head-on accident on a rainy night. The other driver walked away with very minor scratches, but I was left in a coma. When I recovered consciousness, I had no memory of the crash, only in the minutes after. The physicians had advised my family that there was very little brain activity. Dr. Chin conveyed it to them kindly. There is still hope. Some patients take months to improve. We'll just have to wait, he explained. But Rachel did not want to wait. No, she had different plans. I overheard her voice, shrill and impatient, as she spoke to my family. We cannot wait months. There are decisions to be made and accounts to be managed, she remarked, sounding far more like the entrepreneur she had always aspired to be than like my sister, and that's when it started. The gradual, deliberate invasion of my existence. I wanted to shout. I wanted to shake my body free from its paralyzing cage, to show them that I could hear every word and was still present. However, my body refused to cooperate. My mind was alert and running, but there was no means to communicate. The silence was deafening, but Rachel didn't care. She carried on as if nothing was amiss, taking the position I'd spent years establishing for myself. She accessed my bank accounts to pay medical costs, moved into my home to keep it in good condition, and began making decisions as if she had always been me. Nobody questioned it. After all, we are identical twins. Who knows the difference? I overheard her speaking to our mother one afternoon. Her voice was smooth and convincing, the type of voice she used when manipulating others. I've spoken with the partners at the firm, she told her. They've agreed to let me step in temporarily to handle Rebecca's clients while she's indisposed. My law practice, which I had created from the bottom up over the previous 10 years, was now in the hands of my sister. I'd spent my whole career specializing in corporate fraud, and I'd developed a reputation that required years of hard work and ethics to establish. It was the last thing I expected her to take from me. But it did not end there. No. She began wearing my clothes, using my credit cards, and visiting my friends for coffee, all while pretending to be me. It was uncanny. She entered my life as if it were her own, and I couldn't stop her. Then, 6 months into my coma, Mark began visiting. Not to see me, but to see Rachel. Mark, my fiancé. I had loved him for 2 years, and I expected him to stick by my side through thick and thin. He had been my partner, an equal, and the only person who knew me better than anybody else, or so I thought. One evening, I heard him speak in a tone of admiration and something else. "You even laugh like her," he added, his words piercing my heart. Rachel's reaction was cold and confident. "I am her," she explained, "simply better. More alive," I wanted to shout. I wanted to tear her apart, but I could not do anything. I lay there, locked in my own body, as my world collapsed around me. They planned my life, my home, my money, and my future, while I lay there, helpless to move. What they didn't know, and Rachel never cared to verify, was the concealed defense I had set in place. Behind a false wall in my basement, I had hidden everything I needed to reclaim my life. Plans, backup systems, and contingency measures. I'd always known Rachel was capable of betraying me. She had always felt envious and resentful of my achievements. I've never totally trusted anyone, including my family. Especially not family. What Rachel didn't realize was that I had anticipated her every move. For months, I lay in a coma, powerless but not uninformed. I could hear every whispered chat surrounding my hospital bed, every word of betrayal. I knew who was visiting, who wasn't, and who was stealing from me. Rachel assumed I couldn't hear. She believed that my body was my prison, and that I was a powerless, mute shell of the woman I once was. But she was mistaken. The truth was, I had planned for this. For years, I had been ready for the day when Rachel would decide to take my position. She had always envied my work and life. I had always expected her to try something like this, steal all I had worked so hard to establish. I knew her too well. I spent every day stuck in my own body, hoping for something to change. Then one night it occurred. Lisa, my night nurse, entered my room and began talking to me as she often did. Little updates on the outside world, fragments of conversations, and even the occasional joke to make me feel less alone. But something changed that night. Lisa had been the first to detect the tiny changes in my vital signs. She saw how my heart rate increased when specific words or phrases were stated. It was the start of something I'd been waiting for. "Can you hear me?" she muttered, her voice barely audible. I wanted to yell back. I wanted to implore her to believe that I was still present and could hear every word, but my body failed me. It refused to move. Despite the stifling gloom, there was a ray of optimism. Lisa's eyes widened as I managed to blink once, only once, to indicate that I could hear her. "Oh my God," she exclaimed. "How long?" Another blink. Lisa became my ally after that. She gave me a letterboard to help me communicate, carefully spelling out the words I couldn't utter. It was hard and exhausting labor, but it was the only way I could get my point out. I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. Rachel had taken everything from me, including my life, work, home, and fiancé. She'd braided herself into every facet of my life, pretending to be me. But I knew it would not last. I knew I had a plan, a defense, concealed deep within the walls of my home. "You have to check the basement," I managed to spell out one night, my fingers quivering with strain. "Behind the wine rack." Lisa was silent for a minute. Then I heard her grumbling to herself as she began going through my possessions. She had already begun to serve as my eyes and ears in the outside world, gathering information and keeping track of Rachel's activities. She found the phone. The backup phone I had hidden before the disaster. Rachel had never heard of it. The cops had missed it during their original investigation, and I'd been too cautious to let anyone discover it. It was my lifeblood. With it, I could access everything I had stored. The concealed cameras, the security feeds, and the files on my computer provided all of the necessary evidence. "Your sister's been using your regular phone," Lisa told me that night, surprised. "But I found this one. It was hidden among your belongings. She never discovered it." The backup phone was encrypted, but I had it configured to record everything Rachel did, every step she made, every call she made, and every document she falsified. I had expected her to try to hide her tracks, so I had taken precautions. And now, with Lisa's assistance, I could access the files. "Check the basement," I said again, my heart racing in my chest. Lisa did not hesitate. She opened the phone and followed my directions, accessing the security stream from my home. As the video feeds appeared on the screen, I noticed Rachel sitting on my couch, wearing my favorite sweater and sipping from a glass of wine I had purchased only weeks before the accident. She was living my life while pretending to be me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But the basement feed was what I'd been looking for. The artificial wall remains intact, its contents undisturbed. Rachel hadn't bothered to go down there. She was very sensitive, too terrified of spiders and darkness. I knew that was her weakness. I knew that when the time came, that would be the one thing she couldn't beat. "Check the security feeds," I said quietly across the letterboard, my fingers trembling with eagerness. Lisa did. And when she realized what was hiding behind that false wall, her eyes widened with surprise. Behind it was a room packed with monitors, servers, and, most crucially, a safe. But the true prize was what was on those screens, video records of everything that had happened during the previous year. I had caught every falsehood, unlawful transaction, and act of betrayal. Rachel had been extremely cautious, too cautious perhaps. She had done a good job of covering her tracks, but she had no idea there were cameras. She had no idea I had set up a network of covert eyes to observe her every move. Now it was all there. Evidence, proof, everything I needed to reclaim what was mine. I spelled out, "Call Detective Martinez," pushing myself to concentrate on the work at hand. Lisa placed the call, and as I saw her speak with the police, I realized how much had been robbed from me. Rachel had taken my life, identity, and future. She had attempted to destroy everything I had worked for, and for a time it appeared like she might succeed. But Rachel had no idea and had never bothered to understand that I had planned for this. I had always stayed one step ahead. The investigators would arrive, they'd arrest her, and I will recover what she had stolen from me. I wasn't prepared to give up just yet, not when there was so much to fight for. When Detective Martinez came the next evening, the tension in the room felt like a palpable presence crushing down on all of us. She had been working on this case for months, prior to the accident. She thought something was wrong from the start. My accident was too handy and precisely timed. She had even suspected Rachel, but they could not prove it. Not yet. However, with the proof from my basement, everything was about to change. I could see it in the detective's eyes as she stood beside my bed. She appeared tired of the dead ends and waiting, but there was a glimmer of optimism now. This was the break they'd been looking for. "I got a call about the accident," Martinez remarked softly, her voice steady but full of knowledge. "At the time, I found it too handy. You were about to testify about hedge fund fraud when you fell into a coma, and your sister walked straight in, like if she was waiting for this moment." She glanced at me, her gaze piercing. "Was it truly an accident, Rebecca?" I blinked once. Yes, she understood. "The other driver," she said, "had vanished. I paid for a flight to Mexico the next day. We couldn't prove anything, but now we can." She stopped, allowing the words to sink in. "You knew this could happen, didn't you?" Another blink. Martinez's gaze softened. "You have been preparing for this all along, haven't you?" "You didn't trust her even then." "I didn't trust anyone, not even family." Lisa had been my eyes in the real world, keeping me updated on Rachel's every action. I could tell Rachel was beginning to panic, feeling the walls closing in around her. She had been spending more time at my place, looking for anything that would help her hide her tracks. She had even gone halfway into the basement once, but she had swiftly returned when she heard a mouse. A minor victory, one that I enjoyed for a moment. "Rachel's getting sloppy," Lisa stated one night. "She keeps calling, looking over her shoulder. I suppose she is worried, and Mark is asking questions." "Getting too close. Good, let her squirm." She had never been adept at being careful, and she could never keep up the act for long. I'd always been the methodical one, the planner. Now she was running out of time. Detective Martinez kept a careful eye on everything, tracking Rachel's movements with the assistance of officers stationed near my house. We were all on edge, knowing that Rachel would eventually do something desperate, but we had to be cautious. Too much pressure, and she'd grab whatever she could. We couldn't let it happen. The night everything changed was the one I'd been waiting for. I'd spent hours in physical therapy, gradually recovering control of my body and working to strengthen my limbs and voice. I needed to be ready. Lisa hurried into my room, her face pale with desperation. "She's in the basement," she murmured. "With Mark." My heart skips a beat. This was it. This was the moment we'd been waiting for. Rachel had gone too far. Rachel and Mark climbed the steps into the basement, and I observed them through the cameras. Flashlights flickered in the darkness as they looked for something. "There has to be something," Rachel said, her voice taut with desperation. Becca would not simply leave everything exposed. She always had backups and contingencies. I do not understand. Mark's voice was subdued and seemingly hesitant. "Why are we actually down here? What are you searching for?" Rachel's spotlight shone across the wine shelf. Nothing. Everything was in place. Nothing was out of the ordinary. But Rachel was beginning to unravel. "I don't know anymore," she stated in an irritated tone. "I need to find something, files or records. Anything I can use to restart?" I saw Mark take a step back, his face a mask of surprise. "Did you try to kill your sister?" A long silence enveloped the room, and I felt a cold sense of contentment. I knew this moment was coming. Mark was finally seeing how deep the lie was. "You don't understand," Rachel implored. "I had no choice. They were coming for me, investigators and clients. I needed to disappear. I needed to take on a new identity." "And what about Becca? She was perfect, successful and respected. Everything I should have been." "Was that why you planned for her car to be hit?" Mark inquired, his voice low but terrified. "Took over her life while she was lying in a hospital bed." Rachel's voice cracked. "She was not intended to linger. The driver said it would be quick. I did not want her to suffer. I simply needed her out of the way." Mark made the mistake of stating what I was expecting to hear. "I love Rebecca," he added, his voice full of emotion. "This is the genuine Rebecca, and you—" He halted, his expression hardened. "You're a monster." That was when Rachel snapped. She took a revolver from her purse and aimed it at Mark, her hands shaking. "Don't move," she said, her voice shaking. "I've come too far to lose everything now." I could feel the panic growing, but I had planned for this time. I had set everything in motion long before Mark entered that basement. I wasn't going to let Rachel get away with it. "Lisa, phone," I said softly, pushing my fingers to move. "Now." She immediately understood. She grabbed my backup phone and entered the code I had set up years ago for an app I had buried deep within the phone. The basement lights abruptly turned on, blinding Rachel and Mark. The artificial wall behind the wine rack started moving, sliding open like a mechanical door. Rachel fell back, dropping her flashlight to the floor. What's happening?" A recorded voice, my voice, resonated throughout the basement. "Are you looking for something, Rachel?" Her breath caught in her throat as the hidden area behind the wall revealed itself, complete with monitors, servers, and a massive safe. The displays sprang to life, displaying recordings of every moment I'd captured. Rachel accessing my accounts, transferring millions to offshore accounts, meeting with the man who'd driven into my car, and even her and Mark in my bed. Rachel froze, unable to fathom what was going on. "No, no," she muttered, barely audible. The monitors flashed and displayed video after video. Each one is a piece of the puzzle, a testimony to her falsehoods and crimes. "You didn't just steal my identity, Rachel," I explained over the recorded message. "You gave me everything I needed to destroy yours." The police were already on the way. Rachel's world was collapsing around her. But for me, this was only the beginning of regaining what I'd lost. The sound of pounding footsteps upstairs startled Rachel. She appeared panicked, wild-eyed, as if she might still avoid reality. The cops were closing in, and the weight of her acts was finally too heavy to ignore. Bang, bang, bang! "Police! Open up!" Mark took a step back from Rachel, his face pale, but he stood taller now, not cowering in the face of her threats. His voice, when it came, was consistent. "It's over, Rachel," he murmured softly. His tone no longer reflected fury, but rather finality. "Let it go?" She gazed at him, that broken, panicked expression still on her face, and for a brief minute I thought she was going to shoot him. But then something changed in her. The fight fled her body immediately. She stood there for a while, her hands quivering over the rifle. The room was filled with tension, and the truth hung in the air like a heavy cloud. And then the gun fell from her grip. It clattered to the ground, making a loud, metallic sound. Detective Martinez burst into the basement, followed by a small group of officers with their firearms drawn but not aimed. They knew this moment was coming, so they were prepared. Rachel's look changed to one of incredulity as the officers rushed around her, their motions precise and quick. I could almost feel the chill of their shackles as they tightened around her wrists. "You're under arrest," Martinez said, her voice firm, a win at last, "for the murder attempt on your sister, identity theft, embezzlement, and a long list of other crimes." Rachel's mascara spilled down her cheeks, her face distorted in fear and disbelief. She didn't speak at first. She was too numb and horrified by how far everything had progressed. However, as they took her past me on the stretcher, I noticed her eyes narrow. "You knew," she exclaimed, the hatred in her voice nearly evident. "You knew, right?" I blinked once. Yes, I'd known for a long time. I started plotting as soon as she took over my life. Growing up next to her, I saw how effortlessly she could control everyone around her. I was prepared. It wasn't just the security systems, the concealed phone, or the secret area in my basement. Knowing my sister too well meant knowing what she would do when she ran out of options. They hauled her away, and Mark remained behind, watching the cops investigate the cellar and catalog the evidence. I couldn't see his face, but I could sense the misery in his voice as he spoke with Detective Martinez. "I never saw it coming," he said calmly. "All the time?" "She spent the entire time with me. I thought I loved Rebecca." Martinez nodded, her expression softening somewhat as she watched Rachel's figure fade into the distance. "You weren't the only one," she explained. "We all thought we were looking at Rebecca, but none of us noticed the cracks. The betrayal." "I should have known," Mark mumbled. "I should have seen it." I felt a strange feeling of finality as they led Rachel away, while knowing it wouldn't be that simple. Nothing with my sister ever was, but I also realized that my life belonged to me again. The proof was damning, and now Rachel's falsehoods and machinations would be held accountable. There was nothing more to hide. The following several weeks were a blur. My doctors were amazed by my recuperation. In just a few months, I went from hardly being able to move to walking with help. I spoke again, first quietly, then more confidently as my voice returned. It was like relearning a piece of myself that I thought I'd lost forever. My therapists were amazed by how quickly I progressed, but I wasn't. I'd always been determined, willing to push myself when necessary. However, the actual effort was done behind the scenes. Detective Martinez and her crew had already begun to piece together the entire extent of Rachel's misdeeds. The offshore accounts had been frozen, and detectives were seeking to recover every dime Rachel had taken. Her clients, many of whom had been duped by her acts at the investment firm, were contacted. The consequences of her actions were weighing heavily on her. I watched as she was led to trial, her face a picture of defeat. Mark had left town and moved to California, but I knew he would bring the burden of guilt with him. He had trusted Rachel when he should not have, but I knew he was a victim of her deception. As for me, I stopped blaming him. I had to face the lady in the mirror now, Rebecca Taylor, the woman who had been deceived, but who had come back stronger. It took me 6 months to convince myself to return home. The house was silent now, free of the remnants of Rachel's life. The rooms were empty, and the walls no longer echoed with the lies she'd told. But I didn't go upstairs or to the living room. I went directly to the basement, the chamber where everything had been buried. The monitors were still on, so I stood there for a long time, observing them. The surveillance footage from my office, my residence, and even Rachel's apartment continued to stream across the displays. They served as a reminder of all I'd done to protect myself, including every contingency plan I'd devised. But they were also a reminder of what I had lost. I took up my phone and reviewed Rachel's message, which I had neglected for weeks. It had emerged from her prison cell. "How long did you know I would try to become you?" I took a breath and composed a short, unembellished response. "Since we were children. You've always wanted my life, but you never realized what it took to build it." Her response came fast, in only 2 words. "I apologize. Unfortunately, it was too late. Her decisions had been made, and she would now have to pay the consequences. She had stolen my life, but she had no idea what it really meant to live it, to build it. I wasn't the sister she wished to be. I was not the sister she attempted to steal. I was Rebecca Taylor, and I always knew what it would take to win. The law firm reopened soon after I returned. My coma experience, which included witnessing my sister take my identity, provided me with a unique viewpoint on identity theft and corporate fraud. My tale made national headlines, and I quickly began working with security businesses, sharing my experiences and offering advice on how to protect oneself from the types of betrayals I had witnessed. Life went on, but I wasn't the same guy who had fallen into a coma. I was stronger, smarter, and ready for whatever the future contained. The house was sold, and I purchased a new one with improved security, a place that was genuinely mine. Sometimes late at night I think about Rachel, about how, in the end, she never realized that being me meant more than just success. It was about planning. The understanding that a wall or a security system is not always the greatest defense against betrayal. It's simply being ready for the worst, even if it comes from the ones you trust the most. Even if it is family, I could finally live my life again, not as a betrayed sister, but as a woman who knew how to protect herself. Months passed, and life gradually returned to normal. I'd recovered enough of myself, my strength, to return to work. But it wasn't just about reclaiming what I'd lost, it was also about reestablishing my own sense of purpose. The law firm I'd spent a decade establishing had been a lifeline. My primary concentration had always been corporate fraud, but I had just become an expert in identity theft, which felt both terrible and ironic. My experience had been told in the media, and while it was still difficult to recall the details of Rachel's treachery, I took solace in knowing that what I had gone through could assist others. It was rather cathartic, actually, helping fraud victims, sharing what I'd learned about trust, security, and the need of knowing when to expect the worst. It all seemed appropriate. Every client I assisted, every case I took on, gave me a little more tranquility, but it was not simple. Every time I sat at my desk and looked across at the vacant chair where Rachel used to sit in the beginning, I was reminded of everything she had taken from me. She hadn't just ended my life for the year. She had accepted my trust. And while I had regained my house, work, and even my health, I had yet to truly return the part of me that had been shook to its core. And then there was Mark. He still sent me texts on occasion, apologizing, asking what went wrong, and expressing regret. But I never responded. There was nothing more to say. He'd been just another victim of Rachel's games, a piece in her devious plan. I'd once loved him, but now I realized that the trust I'd put in him was just another thing to let go. When I moved into my new home, I made an effort to surround myself with protection, both physical and emotional. I could not afford to be complacent. Not anymore. The alarms were more advanced and the cameras were better concealed. I even engaged a private security expert who had previously worked in corporate security and was familiar with the types of dangers I faced. But I also took the decision to surround myself with individuals I knew I could trust, people who would not betray me in the same way that my own sister did. One evening, as I sat on the back patio with a glass of wine, I reflected about the previous years. The accident, the coma, Rachel's ascension in my place, and her eventual demise all felt like a nightmare from which I might finally awaken. But the reality was, I didn't want to think about the past anymore. Rachel was behind bars where she belonged, and it was time for me to stop peering over my shoulder. My phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. It was a communication from prison, the first in months. I can't stop thinking about what you said in the basement. How long did you know I would try to become you? I had a peculiar sensation of finality as I read it. Rachel had posed the question before, but today, from her prison cell, it seemed like an echo of the past. She would never really understand. I typed a brief response, same as before. Since we were children, you always wanted my life, but you never understood what it took to build it. The message returned quickly. I'm sorry. I stared at those 2 words for a long time, but there was no more place for apologies. There is no space for reconciliation. What had happened between us could not be undone. Rachel had made her decisions, and now she would have to face the consequences. I pressed send and set my phone down. As I gazed at the sky, I felt a powerful sensation of freedom. It wasn't only about Rachel anymore. It was not even about treachery. It was about me, about who I was becoming. A woman who had discovered the hard way that sometimes those closest to you may do the worst things. But this was not the end. That was the beginning. I had gradually rebuilt my life. I had regained the ability to trust myself rather than others. And when the night fell, I knew one thing for certain. Rachel may have taken my identity for a time, but she could never take away what I had created, and that was something she would never comprehend. The days passed, each with its own modest victory. My life had gradually regained its rhythm, but I'd realized that nothing would ever be the same. Not really. There were still nights when I awoke in a cold sweat, the lingering shadow of Rachel's betrayal sneaking back into my thoughts. But it was fading, slowly. I'd learned to live with it, perhaps not forgive it, at least not yet. I didn't have to shoulder that weight anymore. There was something liberating about that. The rage, the perplexity, the sensation of violation began to fade with each fresh stride forward. I'd spent years creating a life for myself only to have it snatched away. But now I was rebuilding it myself, brick by brick. I had learnt the most difficult lesson of all. Nothing is ever truly safe, and everything may be taken from you in an instant. However, this did not imply you couldn't get it back. The first time I returned to work after my recovery, I felt a peculiar mix of anxiety and resolve. It was difficult to enter into that familiar space and not remember Rachel, how she had stolen my position and impersonated me without hesitation. I could practically hear her voice booming through the corridors, claiming to be me, chatting to my clients, and making choices on my behalf. But it was all over now. The firm was still mine, the clients still trusted me, they were waiting for my return, and I came back not only to retake my position, but also to prove to myself that I still had control over my own life. Mark had relocated to California soon after the trial, and I couldn't bring myself to call him. The lies we'd told each other had created an impassable barrier. I wasn't sure which hurt more, my sister's treachery or his, but the truth was that none of them were who I assumed they were, and I couldn't go back. That chapter of my life was over. My heart had hardened slightly, but this was the only way I could protect myself. There were no more second chances. Trust, I'd learnt, was something you earned. As time passed, I began to feel like myself again. My physical therapy has advanced a long way. I could walk without assistance now, and while I still had a minor limp, it felt liberating. Each stride reminded me of how far I had come. The agony was no longer consistent. Instead, there was a calm strength that developed with every day. I had persevered. I had survived. In the end, that was what counted. My new home, while still strange, became my haven. It was more than just a place to live. It was a space that I had created for myself. I installed the best security system possible. Everything was high-tech, hidden, and bulletproof for both physical safety and peace of mind. I can never be too careful. Not after all that had happened. A few months later, I received my first public speaking opportunity. It wasn't much, just a modest conference on cybersecurity and corporate fraud, but it felt like a success. I was sharing my tale and using my experience to teach others. And as I spoke to the audience, I realized that I wasn't simply discussing fraud and identity theft, but also about resiliency. I was discussing survival. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't merely a victim of Rachel's actions. I had emerged from it stronger, smarter, and more capable than ever before. Then, one day, as I was reading emails at my desk, I received another communication from the prison. I was almost frightened of opening it. But curiosity got the better of me. I know I can't fix this, but I want you to know I never meant to hurt you. I was always jealous of you. You were everything I wanted to be, and I thought I could just take it. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the gravity of her words. It wasn't a confession, really. It was just more of Rachel's manipulation, even from prison. But this time, I was not going to fall for it. I pressed erase and moved on. I had nothing left to say. As the years passed, I became more content with the life I'd established. My business was prospering, I had a close group of friends who genuinely cared about me, and I had learned to trust again, albeit not in the same way I had previously. Trust, for me, had become something valuable, something earned. However, it wasn't just about the individuals in my life, it was about trusting myself. I had the strength to survive, the intellect to outwit the worst-case scenario, and the fortitude to continue pushing forward. Naturally, I thought of Rachel. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if things had gone differently, if she had not made the decision she did, if she hadn't chosen to take everything from me. But then I remembered what my therapist had told me. You can't change the past, but you can control how you move forward. I moved forward, stronger, smarter, and I am more prepared than ever to tackle whatever life has in store for me next. I knew Rachel would never change. She would always be the person who attempted to take my life and destroy everything I had worked for. But she never realized, failed to grasp, that my existence was more than just what I had. It was about who I was. Nobody could take that from me.